Welcome, folks. I'm Tom. I work with the Promise Scotland, but I've also been involved with the community of practice for siblings for quite a wee while now, from its very beginnings. And it's lovely to be here on a bright afternoon in the Glasgow sunshine. We're joined together with some lovely guests at this podcast, and we're just going to introduce ourselves, I think, also with just talking a little bit about something that stood out from today. We've just all come from a community of practice for siblings gathering in Glasgow itself at the SCRA, the Scottish Children's Reporters Administration offices in the centre of Glasgow. And it would be lovely just to hear, as we introduce ourselves and what, brings us here today, it would be lovely to hear of anything that stood out in particular from today's session. So I've already introduced myself, but in terms of something that stood out from today, I think, in that setting of quite a formal setting of hearings and the ways in which we make fundamental decisions about children's lives in Scotland, the thing that stood out for me was people with good intent coming together, collaborating, trying to do their very best to support sibling and sibling-like relationships across Scotland. So that stood out for me, and I'll turn to Elaine.
Yeah, I'm Elaine Goudie. I'm an assistant service manager in the foster and adoption team in Glasgow, and I think this is... there's a number of the events that I've attended, and I think similar to you, Tom, it's about people coming together and having a real enthusiasm to try and change things for siblings in Scotland.
Kate?
Hi, so I'm Kate Richardson. I'm the manager of Scotland's Adoption Register, but I'm also the de facto chair of Stand Up for Siblings, and alongside Elaine and Tom, member of the planning group for the community of practice. I think today, for me, it was really special because we had young people in attendance, and not just in attendance, but contributing and leading discussions and giving presentations. And that was just fantastic, because we have been saying for years, this needs to be less about the adults and more about the young people. So that's really been special today. Yeah.
That's great, Kate. Thanks very much. And Frances?
Hello, I'm Frances Maguire. I'm a service manager working in Glasgow, and my role in Glasgow is to manage the independent care and review team with a lead for the Promise in Glasgow. And my standout today, and you've kind of stolen a wee bit my thunder, Kate, I was just so impressed by the young people in attendance. I've got a bit of a role for Glasgow's Champs, and participation is a bit of a passion. So when I hear those young people speak out with such confidence, and knowing that hasn't always been easy for them, I think it's absolutely a real kind of a reinforcement of what those opportunities can provide for young people. So yeah, that was also my highlight as well.
And along with that, there was, at the later stage of the day, also this wonderful thing of hearing from those with lived experience of older ages in professional roles, and one of them, I think, referred to that sort of dual expertise, bringing the expertise of their professional roles alongside the expertise of their lived experience. So yeah, voice of all sorts and experience of all sorts, very much a theme through today. So we'll come back to hearing a little bit more about what some of the events for the community of practice, both online and in person, have touched on, or trying to nurture and cultivate in Scotland. But it would be lovely, first of all, to hear a little bit about the history of what the community of practice has arisen from. And I might turn to you, Kate, for your thoughts on that. Before that, we've already been using these different terms: sibling-like, brothers and sisters, friendship, an increasing theme, I think, in community discussions, really growing theme in community discussions. So, Kate, anything you'd like to say about that? The different words that we try and use for talking about these very crucial relationships that matter in people's lives.
Language is such a big discussion point, and young people, of course, should be telling us what they want us to use. And I think when it comes down to it, it often comes down to that young person or that child or that particular group, if you're in a group setting, on that particular day. And we have to respect that. And at the same time, we have that dual role of the fact that legislation uses sibling and sibling-like relationships, and gives it a definition for use in a legal context. But it's that balance of, well, we're going to use that and it means that for that legal context, but actually in every other context, we are going to use what that young person wants. So we have young people saying, we prefer brothers and sisters. And we have young people saying, quite like the fact that sibling doesn't define you in any particular way. And actually, even though we talk a lot about sibling-like, which is much harder to define, and often is really spreading into what young people would say, actually, they're just my best friends and they're as close to me, they know me better than anybody else. So who matters to that child at that point in time? And it doesn't define your gender or your sexuality or where you live and who you are. It's just about that relationship. And so I think, so you end up trying to use everything, saying brothers and sisters, siblings, sibling-like relationships, or in that particular context, you will use what the young people would like.
Yeah. And I think certainly in what we've been hearing quite a lot in community of practice sessions recently, the term sibling-like overlaps a lot with friendship too, and would that be a fair?
Yeah, I think in terms of work we've done in Glasgow around developing our assessment framework and supporting young people have better supported relationships, there's definitely a sense that wider connections are really important, and it might not meet that sibling-like definition, which is they have to have lived with each other, but when a young person is in a position where they might be moving to live elsewhere, there's really important connections to leave behind that can be as important as birth or biological relationships. And the value in us thinking about how to support them is huge to that young person.
So, community practice for siblings, that's what we call it, but it's for brothers, sisters, friends. It's about being alongside folks with important relationships and trying to do our best by them. A little bit about the history, Kate. You're steeped in it, I know, from the Stand Up for Siblings role that you now play, but So
Stand Up for Siblings, was started by Christine Jones, who herself an adoptive parent of siblings and was a lecturer in social work at Strathclyde University, and she did some lovely research alongside SCRA into the number of children who were separated and when they came into care and whose relationships were affected by the fact that they'd been separated, in terms of the longevity of that separation often meant whatever the direction of care, whether it went into permanence or maybe they returned to different family members, but the separation continued. And the passion that Chris had, that then inspired others to come on board. So SCRA came on board, Who Cares, champions from various different local authorities and organisations, and it became a membership group. And so I was involved from when that formed in 2018, and when Chris stood down, they all, in their wisdom, decided I should be chair, but big boots to fill. But we worked really hard, everybody worked really hard to push forward the bill in order to get some legislation through that made sure that children and young people's rights were treated with given as much respect and weight as their relationships with their birth parents. Especially when it came to hearings, but also when it came to living together and how maintaining relationships. And obviously, as a result of the legislative change, when it came into force in July 2021, then CELSIS were given that kind of role to help provide guidance. And so we provided advice on that. And again, we were then asked to make recommendations to Scottish Government in terms of the way to go forward. And one of the recommendations was about having a central resource, a community of practice that brought people together from across the whole of Scotland, so that we could somehow map and bring together people so we knew what was going on in other areas and learn from one another. But that grew up out of the promise work that had been done through STAR and AFCA with the evaluation.
Yeah, so we'll come to STAR in just a moment, because it would be lovely to hear, that STAR has been such a sort of foundational, siblings reunited. STAR, a wonderful space within Fife, in a stunning natural environment that's become a bit of a home for the community of practice when it's come together physically. But was also there right at the beginning. We'll come to that in just a moment. But I'm just really interested in thinking about that history out of which the community practice has grown, but that history of Stand Up for Siblings, that history of the promise itself, obviously in 2020, what those big movements were beginning to sort of make us think about in Scotland in terms of sibling-like relationships and friendship, how that was sort of playing out in a place like Glasgow, in the thinking of folks like yourselves, Francis and Elaine, in terms of the importance that was beginning to be given to a focus on these types of relationships in the experience of care.
Yeah, I mean, I think relationships and maintaining relationships for the children that we care for in the local authority hasn't been a new concept. I think that that people have recognised that it is really important to maintain healthy adult and brothers and sister relationships. However, I think the promise gave us permission to do things differently. And certainly in the independent care and review team, when I joined in 2022, we talked a lot about that permission to do things differently, to reimagine care, and that would be through relationships and really thinking differently about, well, how can we, as opposed to we can't, and be risk averse. So I think in terms of relationships, the concept of having that, that safe adult has always been there. But we needed to really think about how do we create the relationships between brothers, sisters and other people, because certainly as an IRO, before I did this job, it came up a lot in individual meetings within a group of IROs. We talked about practice. But I mean, I've various examples of, as a child's IRO, asking about a previous primary teacher or a previous carer or a previous, a pet, because that's what was important to that child, and really thinking about, well, let's think about that. Why can't we make that happen? And I think the promise has, as I say, allowed us to do that and really think creatively about those important connections.
That was a really strong theme in one of the breakout sessions at today's community practice session that I was in, was just that the promise has been a framing for enabling brilliant practice, brilliant approaches, brilliant ways of being alongside those that we serve. That has brought us together, with shared intent, has given us a sort of frame for that. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, one of my colleagues would say it was a door that was waiting to be pushed, I suppose. And I remember reading the promise and the comments about, particularly about siblings, but also sibling-like relationships, and coming from that background of working with children and young people and now adults who were living in foster care or were adopted, that sibling-like relationship not being valued in the past in the way it is now, and that huge importance on those relationships. And I think we were reflecting earlier about the change when we're making plans for children and young people. Now it's well, certainly within Glasgow, it's very common for people to be volunteering other adults or other children who are really important to children, not just birth relationships, where in the past, I think if we're honest, the conversations about sibling would be quite low in the list of priorities of everything we talk about at a planning meeting or a children's hearing. And now that's much further up. Relationships of all sorts are considered in a different way, which is incredibly positive.
So, STAR, Siblings Reunited, who can tell us a little bit about that? Who's been to STAR? I know, Kate, you are there regularly. Elaine? I'm not sure, Francis. So those of us who have been there, it was the location for the first ever in-person, in fact, the first ever in-person or online, of any sort, gathering of the community of practice for siblings, before it was even called that, but that's what it really became. What is it that stands out about Star for us as a place that fuels this sort of shared vision and aspiration that we're talking about in terms of what the promise has to say about sibling and sibling-like relationships?
I always kind of hold on to things that people have said when they've come for events when we hold it, because obviously I am there a lot. So when, as a supervisor, you become very accustomed.
You might have to explain what. Tell us a little bit about what Star Siblings Reunited does.
So Siblings Reunited, I suppose it's like says what it says. It does what it says on the tin, and it's about bringing brothers and sisters together who are not living together for whatever reason, whether they're in different foster families or whether they're across different family setups, whether they're adopted, kinship still at home, and about giving them a safe space to come together on a farm space where there's lots of room to roam, and also the ability to be able to curry in Christmas time to watch a Christmas movie and have hot chocolate, to going down to the woods. We were doing that last weekend. I had a family group together. We were down the woods. We did a fire pit. So they're helping, and you're making sure that they all get to help, and they're lighting the fire and they're toasting marshmallows. They're celebrating their special events together, even if it's not actually on the date, of the nearest one's birthday. You'll have birthdays, Christmas, Halloween. It's a really special place that Karen Morrison, who founded Siblings Reunited, has pulled together. So I am very accustomed to being there and love being in that space. And then when people come for the community of practice events and they talk about how the space reminds them of why they come together, there's the play equipment, obviously, and there's the items, but there's things that have been made by the children that are hanging around. Mm-hmm. There's pictures that have been taken. There's photographs. There's just a constant reminder through the actual physical space of why it is we do what we do. And so people will often comment on that. And that was one of the focuses that we had for one of our community of practice events, and we actually held it at Victoria Quay. So it was, how can we make this space?
So again, what's Victoria Quay for those who,
So Victoria Quay, Scottish Government, civil service building down in Leith.
Headquarters, very sort of great big formal
very
edifice
empty,
of a building.
Very empty building with lots of space. And we were focusing on space and place and what that means for children and young people when they come together, and how that looks, and family journeys helped us with that. But it was, we were down in our corners creating spaces almost like dens, or building things out of Lego, or building a den underneath the table, and just really kind of getting a sense of how you can make any kind of space into a space that children and young people will claim and take over. Yeah.
One of the words that crops up a lot in the context of Star Siblings Reunited is magic, and actually the last physical session that was there earlier this year, again, wonderful under a wild sky and with swallows darting around and so on. One of the themes was memory, and the memories that are important for identity in the experience of growing up and in the experience of early adulthood, magic within memory of and the experience of childhood is a really, really important aspect, isn't it? And you sort of feel that in the space. Anything that stands out for you, Elaine, when you go or come away from Star? What are you feeling?
I suppose the only time I've been there's been no children, which is a bit disappointing. But I suppose just reflecting, some of my colleagues recently were there for an event with children, and what their reflections was it was a child's space. It was, they led it, and the adults are there secondary. And I suppose a similar event, they've attended where it's been held in like a school or something, and just that, it was almost like the adults creating a space for the child, whereas as I say, it's a child's space. And as you've said already, you feel their presence, even though they're not there. You feel the presence of those that have already been there and spend time there regularly, because it's all around their artwork, things I've created. So, yeah.
Along with the hens sort of dabbing their way across
And
the
the
ground.
cockerels announcing
Someone was
themselves,
saying to me just earlier that always when they're at Star, the memories are sort of interwoven with beautiful creatures of different species alongside us, as part of the scene. So the community of practice, we've talked a little bit of where it came from. It meets in person in lots and lots of different interesting settings, from the sort of more formal settings of Victoria Quay and government, and even the process of going into that building, which is quite challenging. The idea and so quite interesting for thinking about also the experience of young people navigating systems and. All the way to Star and the beauty there, and then SCRA, Reporters Administration, in the central biggest office in Scotland for the Reporters Administration today. So meeting in person in different settings, but also meeting online has become a really foundational aspect of the community's ability to reach lots of folks who are interested in this agenda or passionate about this agenda across Scotland. And that, I think, Elaine, was how you and Glasgow, in a way, most directly first became involved in the community of practice, was an online session. Can you tell us a wee bit about what brought you there and how it felt to be a part of it, coming in that way?
Yeah, well, I suppose we were myself and a colleague, Roger England, were asked to come and talk about how we developed the family connection assessment in Glasgow, and that was through our connections as a local authority with Stand Up for Siblings and AFCA. So we came to talk about what we were doing. At that point, it was a pilot of the new assessment, and we now have the final version of that. But I suppose for me, obviously we were happy to share our information and share what we were doing, but it's very much a two-way process. So when you're sharing, you're also getting reflections for other people and learning from that. And it's in terms of that pilot of the framework, that really helped us, because we were able to go and share, even with some of the connections we made through the community practice, we were able to go and have conversations with other local authorities and other organisations, and share ideas, and that helped us think about what we were planning to do when we finalised the assessment framework. And it's continued to, I suppose, some of those relationships we developed through community practice have continued, and we're now talking about other things like life story and different aspects of the work we do on a day-to-day basis. You
said in some of your remarks today at the in-person gathering, you said, online is brilliant, but we also really need that recharging that comes from in-person events. And I think we've found that over the sort of journey of the community of practice that has worked really, really well. Big online events and then quite big in-person events, but them both fueling each other in a way. But I'm really interested in this thing about online spaces as spaces of community as well, and connection and openness, and not feeling too overwhelmed by the technology or the being on screen and so on. And obviously you've been to subsequent online sessions, but in that first session, did it feel like a space where you could be having good conversations? I can't remember whether we used breakout spaces specifically. We did, I mean,
I think always when you deliver a presentation online, it's difficult because you can't see everybody, and I think there was about 100 people there, which was quite intimidating. But once we had presented, and obviously we had then breakout rooms, it was a really good opportunity for everybody to talk in detail about a number of the different things that have been shared that day. So absolutely. And there's people, as I say, that I met that day that we're still having conversations with. So it was definitely a really good way to network.
And I think that's how it's grown. We've been able to really reach far distances by having it online. I mean, I think there's kind of, yes, I do think it's really important that we meet, but the online does enable people who can't travel, who couldn't travel the long distances, to give up. It would be almost like 2 days for a short day event, and that way the reach is bigger, so that people can really share their resources right across Scotland. So, and the use of the breakout spaces has been really quite powerful. I think.
I also think in terms of making progress, because when we do meet in person, it doesn't feel like you're starting again, or you need lots of time to warm up to conversations because the relationships have already been developed.
Frances, you've sort of we'll turn to New Horizons, which has been an area that we focused on more recently, emerging out of big themes for the community in a moment. But you've sort of come in, you got to know the community of practice a little bit later than the rest of us. Any sort of sense of what these connections across Scotland, these connections across different, struck again today by the range of different folks. There were people with phenomenal expertise through their own lived experience. There were people there from the third sector across Scotland. There were different local authority areas. Any sort of reflections on what you've sort of been picking up as you've begun to bump up alongside the community of practice in terms of what that type of opportunity offers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, the concept isn't absolutely new, but I think in the last number of years we've really gathered momentum in terms of coming together. We were chatting earlier about, previously you might not have been as comfortable sharing ideas and sharing work across different local authorities and also partners, third sector partners and others. I think you really feel that shift now, which is amazing and right. And I think we all benefit from that. Coming into my current role and using the experiences of other local authorities who have been further ahead, for example, in champs groups and participation and supporting people with lived care experience, I have absolutely benefited from the sharing and the kind of kindness and generosity of others, their willingness to really allow you to learn from their experiences if they're further ahead. So in terms of coming into the New Horizons space, I think I personally am very receptive, and personally I really love that aspect of the job that I'm currently doing, because selfishly I feel as if I'm really developing professionally, and I can also ultimately do my job better if I have got those relationships with others. And I think in that particular group, I don't think it's too big, because I think there's almost a sweet spot of that if things are too big, you kind of start to kind of get into a little bit of a kind of subgroups within. But within that particular space, I think it was almost the perfect number of other local authorities, but also Celsius, Care Inspectorate, Scottish Government, Promise. Yeah. So I think that's been a lovely group, and also people from different roles within the local authorities as well, because I think, again, that brings that kind of a richness and diversity, and recognising that we all have our different skill sets to share. So it's been a really, as much as it's taken a lot through the Horizon. I think those days, I personally left feeling I'd really worked, but in a different way. It was, it's quite full on. Yeah. But ultimately, once you process and you have a bit of space to really reflect, you really start to see the concept emerging, and you're relating that to your day-to-day job and what that could be for us in Glasgow.
So it'd be lovely to hear about what you're now trying to test out a little bit, or beginning to develop in Glasgow, along with some companions from other local authority areas. But just to set the scene a little bit, I suppose, New Horizons was I suppose part. So there's a small planning group, isn't there, that has grown. Actually, it's become quite a large planning group, a very diverse planning group who support the community of practice for siblings, of which Elaine and Kate and myself are members. But we did, alongside companions, like in Scottish Government and some other companions, we did some development work through the course, really, of over the course of 8 or 9 months into the beginning of this year, which was really looking at how can we use the springboard of this community of practice that we feel is offering quite a lot and has been incredibly rich, has touched on lots of diverse big themes, from the experience of kinship care and supporting sibling groups all the way through to friendship. We'll maybe come back to any themes that have really stood out for us in the last couple of years. But how could we push the role a little bit of the community of practice on some of the chunky issues that felt like big challenges? linked to staying together and connected, that great big piece of work that flowed from the legislation, thinking about, and the promise, thinking about what more we could be doing in Scotland to support these relationships. And New Horizons, out of that development, New Horizons identified 3 big areas that we wanted to work on as a community of practice for siblings. One was kinship care and housing, sort of imaginative responses to housing need, not great big expense of new houses and so on, but what could be more imaginative processes that approached housing need through the eyes of kinship carers and those they were caring for. And it might be as simple as a bed that unfolded easily, that sorted out some place for a young person to kip a bit more comfortably. So that was one thing. A second thing was decision-making processes as a whole, the ways in which different processes, formal and slightly less formal, but decision-making processes, hold consideration of sibling and sibling-like relationships, brothers and sisters, friendships, how that might be done better. And a third area, which is the first one we started, was the one that you've been touching on, Francis, which was this first New Horizons theme of the ways in which we try and understand better the relationships that most matter to young people, but particularly the data that we then hold about those relationships. How we better hold that information, that understanding, in ways that allow us to tell a story in our local communities of how well we're doing and how well we're progressing over time to keep the promise to the young folks that we're alongside and the families that they're within. So that was the first New Horizons theme, and all 4 of us, I think, were involved in this first New Horizons project. So it'd be lovely to hear, Francis, you've begun touching on it, but any perspectives about how that process has worked. It's involved a lot of different local authorities, as you said, Francis. It involved other collaborators too. But how has that felt? Elaine, you've been in the nitty-gritty of it from the beginning. How has this particular New Horizons project that we've been sort of journeying along felt as a process?
I mean, I suppose, again, it brought people together across the country, from Aberdeenshire down to the west of Scotland, and people that we've been meeting online, and we were actually for the first time getting into the nitty-gritty, as you say, the practical bits around how we can achieve change. So, and we met in Articulate, which obviously is a service that is about creativity for people with lived experience, and even just
beautiful sort of space in Glasgow. Yeah.
And being in that space surrounded by, visual art created by young people was inspirational itself. So I think even just that, being together in that space, was really, really helpful to get us moving on this. But yeah, I think the first bit for me was how big it is, and I suppose we all know that it's difficult. It's, we know that, I suppose we're social workers. As social workers, we know that we have not achieved what we would like for siblings or, for young people's connections. And that's why the promise talks so much about that particular theme. But I think being together in that room really helped us realise why we've got to that point, because it's so complex. There's different thoughts and different processes across the whole of the country. But again, there was that absolute willingness to try and work together to try and achieve change. And I think, a sense that we want some sort of commonality across the country as well, so that we're working in similar ways, even though we might have different information systems, we might have slightly different processes, but try and ensure that young people in Scotland have a similar experience. We
tried from the beginning to root ourselves, in what the experiences of life might be through those with lived experience. There wasn't necessarily lived experience in the immediate direct space, although a lot of those involved have very strong participatory networks of those with lived experience, where which allows for sort of sense checking. And there's definitely plans with some of the work that's been developed out of New Horizons to begin some very active co-design with folks with expertise through lived experience. But we used Callum. We created a composite story to try and sort of a story of an individual's own life journey, I suppose, through early childhood and into later childhood as a way of doing that. Frances, anything you?
Yeah, and I think as practitioners in the room, we all related to Callum's story, and it really did help think about what we currently do and potentially how we could do things better. I think we've all got experience. Well, certainly social workers have got experience of wanting to do better and maybe the differences in practice. And I think so there is absolutely a willingness and an appetite for change, and we know that through Glasgow's work and the feedback from developing the Family Connections and Assessment Plan. But it's the doing it and the consistently doing it, and then understanding when we don't do it, what's going on and how can we do it differently. And within that, there's also lots of grey areas of why we might not do that, around rights and around choice. And we talked a bit about, I don't know if it was the last session or the session before, about I, as a reviewing officer, I know some children, people would say, I don't want to talk about relationships. I don't want to have that in this space. That's for me, not for you. And so there's lots of differences that we would absolutely celebrate. But I think ultimately, how do we create a system? Because it shouldn't be individuals, it should be our systems around those children that we are checking in at different points and giving opportunity to make those choices, yes or no, or whatever.
Yeah.
And our system should reflect that. And I think if we're able to develop that and work through how we can do this better, we would have families and children absolute influence in telling us along the way what we're doing and what we're not doing, to be able to flex and shift. Yeah. So this is, I think, a real opportunity to really start where we are.
Yeah.
Lots of really good work being done. But how can we make this a bit more of a systemic shift as opposed to the pockets of really good practice and real people really want to do better, but how do we really help our workforce in Glasgow, national and other local authorities, to be able to do this and get this and do it better for children?
Yeah. So we've got. I'm exhausted at times with the whole. I think we all have been at times with the New Horizons journey, but also incredibly sort of. I am excited as well, and we've got within this first New Horizons bash, we've got a number of sort of opportunity areas that have been identified. There's one really fascinating one that's just in the earlier stages, but about friendship again, really returning to that. I think we felt, didn't we, that in the journey as a whole, actually, that friendship became much more of a dominant theme than sibling-like, friendship. And that's been true in broader community discussions, I think, really interesting. So anyway, there's one that's really focused on that, a bit of co-design work that links to some fascinating work that Autumn Roche-Marsh at Edinburgh University has been supporting in relation to better understanding friendship and the experience of care. We've got one that's about trying to use the data and the processes that are already there to a large extent in relation to permanency in a way that allows us to get a better handle on how we're doing by sibling and sibling-like relationships. So there's one that's been developed there with a number of the partners or collaborators involved rolling up their sleeves on that. There's some work that we're hoping to really develop about the telling the story aspect of that data, sort of in local areas, how that could be done better in a more compelling way. But the one that's most live for Elaine and Frances, with support from the community and support from the New Horizons collaboration, is one that's focused on reviews. So can you tell us a wee bit about that?
Okay, so I think we got to reviews kind of fairly early on in our kind of in-person discussions. It did feel like a real opportunity for us to kind of start there. Whilst we were trying to work through what I think personally felt a little bit abstract initially and trying to really think, well, what is it we're trying to do? So I was very drawn to reviews being a starting point, having been an IRO and also now supporting IROs in Glasgow. So I felt there was a real opportunity there in terms of really just thinking about the initial stages of a child's care experience and really using that opportunity to think about who is important in that child's life. And we know that relationships matter so much and absolutely should be one of the top 3 priorities, in my opinion, in terms of that particular stage, or any stage, but that particular stage when there's so much going on, it's such a big transition. So we really wanted to use that opportunity to measure and think and influence how we got that. We did it better, and again, how we captured and recorded and really thought about what we have available to us in Glasgow and what we might need to do differently in terms of IT systems. But absolutely reinforcing the message across the group, I think, the test group, that this is really important. And I think by solidifying and really thinking about the recording and the data, it kind of reinforces that. It really helps practice if it's there and people know that this is what we would want to do. I think in terms of really thinking about practice, that data is going to really help us, but that's probably further down. But really the starting point is recording, thinking and kind of acting upon through our group. Again, that diverse group in Glasgow, people, lots of different skill sets, and also then sharing with our colleagues and other local authorities, which I think is so invaluable.
Yeah, you did a lovely input to today's community of practice session, which got really, and there was a breakout session afterwards, which there's lots of for example, there was, in my breakout space, there was real feeling that what you'd highlighted in terms of those very earliest stages of review-like processes in the experience of care, those earliest stages being absolutely crucial. 3 months downstream, 3 months for a young person is an ocean of time, and in real complexity and often huge challenge in those earliest stages of a journey that may lead into longer term care, or how one creates the space to understand the key relationships then. Felt that was one of the big themes. The folks in my space were really interested in the way you touched on that today. Elaine, anything you?
Yeah, I think, in Glasgow there's been sibling assessment. I've been a children family social worker for 20 years and there's always been some form of sibling assessment, but it tended to be done round about the time of parents' decisions being made. It was a one-off assessment that I suppose was never then revisited. So when it was probably about 2022, we developed the pilot, the Family Connections Assessment, and that was something that we were really keen to do, was about drawing that forward so that we were thinking about it in the really early stages, because from our own experience, but also from research, we know that if those connections are lost in the early stages of a child becoming care experience, then it's really hard to revisit that. And parents planning it can take some time, so we could be 2, 3, 4 years before that assessment was being done and the way and our processes were at the time. So I think we feel now we have an assessment framework, a 2-stage framework that looks at first stage, looking at straight away as soon as children come in and into our care, that we are at the very least looking at who's around them, completing an eco map to look at who is within their network, but also a face-to-face conversation with the child by whoever the most appropriate person is, who's got the best connection with them, to get a sense of from them about who's really important to them and capturing that really, really early. So I think we felt that we were in a position where we like our assessment framework, we think is good, but it's only as good as how it's then implemented. So we need that assessment to be completed, but we also then need a decision-making framework that constantly reviews and revisits and looks at how successful we are in terms of supporting those relationships, but also recognising that your children and young people's needs change over time, different ages and stages, and it might be that, even spending time together when you're very small and you play together feels different when you're a teenager and you've got other priorities. So how do we help the adults around that child or that young person think about holding those relationships for them, so that whatever's right for them at that time continues into adulthood?
So the New Horizons, as we've all touched on, one of the big themes there is this ethos of collaboration. So that's in the New Horizons space, but it's also the learning as we go along. And today's input from yourselves about this New Horizons test of change, one of the opportunity areas identified for this data and telling the story of data theme, really as an example of that. I suppose. Any thoughts about the specific way in which you hope this particular development of this opportunity within this New Horizons piece of work is going to help our understanding through the data that we hold on sibling and sibling-like relationship? Anything that's beginning to emerge about that?
I mean, I also want to highlight the importance of the collective within this, because I think this is an opportunity for us to really think about who is around the child, and it is everyone's shared responsibility, and we're really thinking about relationships. And I think often default position goes to the social worker, and it's really important that we think about that, because it's about everyone's responsibility, if you like. And I think even just the collective of the group in Glasgow and the group nationally is almost mirroring some of the importance of that, as opposed to individuals. Mm-hmm. So I think there is something in there that's quite symbolic almost about how we are. We need the community, we need the group to support. I think in terms of our learning, there'll probably be parts that we kind of know just now, that reasons that might get in the way. I'm hoping that there's others that we will learn in terms of maybe things that we hadn't quite grasped that we could sort, hopefully. But I do think there's an important message about that shared responsibility, and if it's removing barriers, so we really start to unpack what is getting in the way and why this is so important, and really emphasising that message, because I do think it's there. I think people do understand the importance, but I still think at times we can have conversations about why a brother and sister should see each other if they don't have that experience at that time. So there's still a little bit of maybe reframing and really helping people understand that well-intended practice has shifted, maybe about worries or what might happen if a child's living in an environment and there's a new relationship that is introduced, and that is well intended often, most of the time, but sometimes it's we still need to try to really help people to understand that this could be an opportunity to have a new relationship in that child's life. Let's see how that emerges. So I do think there's, in terms of your question about data, I think there's probably bits that we know around barriers about what stops us allowing a child to continue to have a relationship with whoever's important. But let's really think about the group and the collective responsibility, because I think that's the way forward just now in terms of some pressures that are around. And I think that it's not all about the social worker within this, it's about the team and that child and that support network. And there's learning in that if we're going through difficult times, that we're all dependent on each other. It's not just one thing, it's about who's around us.
It's not just that though, it's also building on areas of really good practice that are already there. So it's not just about, well, what is it about that particular barrier that's getting in the way? It's also about, well, over here is an example of where that has been managed really, really well. Let's build on that. let's learn from that to take forward into other areas. So highlighting the positive work. When I sit back and think about how far we have come, and we've still got a long way to go, because awareness raising, breaking down knowledge, and making sure everybody's taking that shared responsibility, we've still got a way to go. But 10 years ago, we were still battling to get people to even recognise those relationships. So I think we have to acknowledge where we are doing things well and how we can build on those
And we've talked a lot about shifting narratives, because there is a lot of negative narratives around what children and families will experience in a local authority. We've got lots still to be done, but there is absolutely, it's so important to share those stories, those positive stories. And we've talked within Glasgow about how do we have them available, and it's to people, to our staff groups and their families. It's not unusual for people, for families and young people to say thank you, and I experienced that was really positive. But again, there's not a place where we would hold some of that information. I don't think we're particularly good at it, but that is absolutely so important. It's information that tells us about relationships, that's working. If someone is choosing to tell, is offering that information. So how do we use that and share it, and also learn from what happened there? Because I'm thinking lots of examples as a reviewing officer. I've been really privileged to hear lots of really positive experiences, and I've thought, that needs to be shared. That has to be shared, because this is what it's about, through relationships.
And that's the story behind the data. And that's the whole thing, isn't it? And it's that whole thing about data will give you numbers, and often, we know about I was going to say the class returns, and you're going to ask me what they are, and then I'd have to look at Elaine. But like any kind of statistics that the government needs in order to evidence, or how are we going to evidence that there's been improvement since the legislation came in, it's the stories that are around that data, because actually, sadly, sometimes the data will look like it hasn't improved, but that's not telling you anything. That's not telling you maybe those children, when they first become care experienced, are living separately. When they came in, it could be 6 months later they're back living with each other. It doesn't tell you that. It also doesn't tell you that they're all seeing each other every week, or more than once a week. They're having sleepovers at each other's foster cares. They're going to the same school. The data doesn't tell you that.
I think that was a motivation for us to look at the reviews as being a focus for collecting data, because, I mean, again, going back to community practice, and I think that's one of the reasons we have this particular new horizon on data, was because a sense that particularly the data that's collected nationally isn't particularly meaningful, on a given day, how many care experienced young people have a sibling, how many of them are living together, how many of them see each other. But it doesn't, the complexity of the relationships that Frances described earlier isn't reflected in that, but also it doesn't reflect the story change. So nationally, we would want to see a story change, because we know that we weren't doing well enough for siblings, and we want that to change. But also in terms of an individual child or young person or their sibling group, we also want to see that there's a shift in that. We can measure that, I suppose, in a crude way through the review, because that would reflect what is around those experiences.
So a richer data.
Numbers
a richer data. And that also, I mean, one of the themes I know that you're exploring at the moment about that is also richer data that also tells us about situations where we really, whatever the relationship, it might be a friendship relationship, but where a relationship really, really needs supporting, but yet for various reasons, and they might be resource reasons, it can't be supported or nurtured to the degree we would wish, and certainly the young person would wish. But having a way of recording that and being able to understand that a bit more would be really helpful. I suppose crucial to say that in all of this activity, both in New Horizons and the Community of Practice for Siblings, we've all sort of touched on it in various ways, but we're also talking about families staying together. We're talking about siblings staying together as best. And again, a big theme today was, whole family support cropped up a lot in the discussion in breakout spaces. So that agenda that's there in the promise, obviously, crucially driving us all to try and find ways of making sure, whatever their circumstances, that siblings can grow up together.
And there is, again, we talked today about that shift in thinking. We were talking about adoption and how in the past adoption, I suppose there was a sense that for that to be successful, the child to bond with their new family, and then I suppose the sibling, if there were other siblings, that was deprioritised because it might impact on the attachment to the new family, whereas now that's been totally turned on its head. And again, within Glasgow, we've done lots in terms of supporting our staff to use the Staying Connected toolkit, which is obviously linked to what we're talking about in terms of thinking about transitions for children, thinking about how we maintain connections during those transitions. And absolutely now, in terms of, even quite young children, having post-adoption support plans that would be written at the point of us matching them with adopters or permanent carers, and thinking about how we maintain those connections, and assessing the carers or the adopters, and during that assessment process, helping them understand the importance of doing that for children, and to make their child's outcome successful, we need to value the relationships that they're in some ways leaving behind and keep them live.
It's so interesting you touched on that, because I'm reminded, Kate, you were speaking about that first ever community of practice gathering in Star, and we did have breakout spaces, beautiful breakout spaces that went off into wild different corners of that setting. We had breakout space on various themes. One I think might even have been about kinship care. Really, obviously now the most common setting for care experience in Scotland. But one was on what is there in our practice narratives that needs challenging. That was one of the, what is there in our practice narratives that needs challenging, and there was fascinating discussion. I think you could rotate around the different breakout spaces, but really rich discussion, which we pulled together and shared. We'll talk about how we share stuff in just a moment, but I was really struck at the most recent community of practice session in Star. Aberdeenshire, one of our companions in the community of practice for siblings, a real companion along the way from Aberdeenshire, came and gave a beautiful story fueled by lived experience. It came through the experiences of children themselves, but also those most intimately around them in their lives and stuff like that, about their experiences in an adoptive journey, a varied adoptive journey across different sibling group, different members of a sibling group, which I came away from that session thinking, this is our practice narratives changing. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was an explicit theme in what Sonia had to say. Mm-hmm. This would not have been what I would have been saying 3 or 4, even 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Certainly 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely, and in the permanence, obviously in the adoption world, which is obviously what I do, but all the time. But the change in the priority in making sure that even if children aren't able to live together in a permanent family together, whether that's going home or whether that's in a different form of family, that their relationship will be promoted and maintained including kind of coming together directly. I hate using the word contact, so I'm not going to use it, even though legally that's what they like. But it is about maintaining those connections, and it's impacting UK-wide. So I think Scotland led the way. We're the only ones to have that legislation about promoting relationships, and it has leaked into other areas where we can't legislate within adoption, but there's an expectation. So we've changed the landscape to say these children have a loving, meaningful relationship, and that will continue for the rest of their lives, regardless of what the form of care is going to be. And that's being taken up. England is doing that. They're putting in proper contact orders to maintain relationships, even though they haven't got the same legislation, we are making having an impact. So, yeah, we've come a long way. And we've got a long way to go, but I do think it's really important for us to constantly acknowledge we have come a long way.
A lot of the discussions today were on that theme of we wouldn't have been in this space collectively. We wouldn't have been hearing the voice, the lived experience voice that everybody was touching on when we kicked off today. We wouldn't have been hearing it in that way. We wouldn't have been valuing it both sort of systemically through these wonderful groups, you know, whether it's champions boards or this wonderful group that the Reporters Administration now have with lived experience within the staff group of lots of different experiences and ages, including carer lived experience too. Those sorts of things systemically weren't around, but also the degree to which we, you know, obviously it was always a fundamental bit of really brilliant practice was to be hearing and alongside young people and families in a way that really heard them. But that is more culturally embedded as a foundation. So, yeah, just a sense of, you know, a lot of challenge and a lot of journey to go, but also a sense of good things that we need to notice too. One final query about that with the New Horizons stuff, because we started with this data one, sounds really sort of clunky and so on, but it's actually, we've unpicked it, we've looked at Callum and so on, we've tried to see data in different ways. We're moving on to again, a really chunky, complex area about how we do better in terms of the living accommodation for kinship families and the kids that they're caring for, how we might be a bit more imaginative about that with very, very tight resource. That's going to be incredibly complex again. Any thoughts about what quality we've needed to bring in this first New Horizons data one? What quality we've needed to bring to try and make progress in the light of complexity? The one that I'll kick off because I felt it really, really personally. I felt that you touched on collaboration, sort of the energy we get from each other, Francis, but I'm also aware we've tried to bring a sort of tenacity, a keeping going at it to the project, an energy, even when at times it felt like that's been the one that stood out for me a bit. I don't know if that's shared by those who've been involved, or, you know, what do we need for the next stage of change in Scotland? You know, what is it we need?
I think I'm using that word again, meaningful, but I think we're now at a point where we're putting it into practice. So we've talked about this very complex area that took us 3 days, hard work to get our heads around in the design days. But we now have, you know, a framework for within Glasgow. We're going to have a test of change and take that forward. Other areas are doing different things. So I think that really helps about putting it into practice. We need to get to a point where we're sitting in front of young people talking about it rather than us all sitting in a room talking about it. And I think that, again, every time we do something, it evolves into something else or helps us think about other things that we need to. So it's like peeling the layers of the onion. There's always something else to do. Yeah. But I think, you know, this stage we're at where we're actually going to look at it in practice. We've now within Glasgow got a broader group around us, including some people from our information system section. Because as social workers, we don't know how to do those bits. So it feels like we've got a real team around us to try and move things forward a bit.
Any other thoughts on what quality we need to bring to this sort of type of work?
I mean, there's a term that's going around in my head, and I'll share it, is prioritising the priorities. And I think for me, personally, there's a bit about keeping the plate spinning a little bit. But I think this is so important, personally, that we absolutely need to keep that momentum going in Glasgow. And I do think there's a real energy, despite us kind of keeping those plates spinning, that this seems to be a priority which has been started through the FCAP work. And how do we really shift practice that this has came at a really opportune moment for us, that we would all want to kind of use for the benefit of our children, young people and families. So I think that energy, as much as it did feel a lot, I feel a little bit more re-energised now. We kind of know what our plan is and we just need to stage this through. There will be barriers. I can anticipate what those barriers are. But I think, personally, I see the importance of this. So those priorities within the priorities is dead important for me as someone who's got some influence in Glasgow with others, and we really want to use that influence to the benefit of others.
Sitting on the outside, it's the buy-in that I see. So you really need the buy-in from further up the chain. And what I've seen is that where that has been, so where all the people that have come forward to do all this work have got that behind them. They know they've got that support behind them. They know we're being encouraged, and that they know that the work they're doing on these days, that they're going to go back, and that's going to be that the momentum is going to keep going. You are going to keep spinning the plates. You will do it. And I think that's what we will need. And I think that's what we're seeing. The people who are coming into the next new horizon with kinship and looking at how we can support kinship carers to provide, really good family accommodation for the children in their care, which doesn't mean that they have to uproot and leave their communities where they can be surrounded by their support networks. The people that are coming forward because the people behind them are saying, yes, we are committed to supporting you to be part of this process. And without that, I think it would be harder.
So we're meeting for the first time online and then in person over the next 3 or 4 weeks. So watch this space and we'll see how that gets. And the data story, telling the story of data, New Horizons Collaborative, this diverse group with all these different opportunities we've been hearing about are coming back together in November. So that's sort of keeping us again that collaborative energy. It's like gentle nudges, isn't it, for each other as we go along. And I got a lovely one of the things that really struck me again in some of the sort of chats. A big theme in the community of practice has been the side chats, particularly in person, obviously, but also in breakout space online, are often incredibly fruitful. And there was a side chat with I won't name them because they said it wasn't yet that sort of stage, but a companion within the community today talking about how just a little offshoot from New Horizons was leading to something interesting for them that was beginning to develop, what they hoped was beginning to develop. And again, that sort of struck me that if you're trying to approach things with good intent and with aspiration and together, you don't quite know where little bits will go off, and actually that's often the most interesting stuff, is the bits that go off in a way that you hadn't planned. We're in a time of renewal. It's the autumn. I love the autumn. It's sort of it's this amazing profusion of beautiful growth over the summer, but it's sort of finding its roots again and bedding down. So I love this period. So it would be nice to sort of think about this time of year as we're thinking about, we've got another beautiful online community event coming up shortly in November. We'll be having a full range of events in person, online, going up on the Stand Up for Siblings space for the community of practice for siblings very soon. So there'll be a lot coming up in the new year too. But what are our feelings about what needs to come next, or what we want to sort of see in terms of the journey of the community of practice in general, I suppose, over the next wee while? Any thoughts on that?
Do you want me to go first? I'm going to take this question. I have, as I said at the beginning, that we've come so far down this road, and we're now getting young people that are coming into the space. And what I'd really like is to build on that. I'd like young people to be leading the way, those who have experience of care, whether that's been for a very short period of time or a long period of time. It's the expertise in that we need, and I'd like them to take some ownership of the space and start taking it on to drive it forward. It's the next generation that are most important, and we need to, I'm not commenting on any of our ages, but we do need to we need to be looking to those young people who have got that drive, and who will build on the work that we're doing and change it maybe. And I love your analogy about it's the roots, and I'm thinking about how the roots spread out under the earth and they touch and communicate, and that lovely story about trees, how trees talk to each other and they can send what they need to each other at different times of need. And that's what we want, is to spread those roots with the young people, I think.
And also those old, young adults, but also older folks
Yes.
with lived experience. I'm so struck that that's a rich sort of beautiful insight. It was a big theme today from various organisations. Children in Scotland, there different inputs from different folks, but where that was a theme, that older lived experience. But also, I was really struck in that by something I remember from wearing different hats at previous stages was we talk about the energy we get, as whatever our expertise, lived experience, or otherwise coming together. And I remember being in settings where younger groups of care experience leaders were coming across older groups of care experience leaders, and the sense of mutual energy that came from that. So I wonder if that's something that we,
There's a lot of learning to be had, but I think it's really important as well for those older care experience to hear.
Yes.
It's really important to hear that things are better for the younger generations. There's still lots of things that we need to improve. Obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we? But for older care experience people to think, well, at least there is progress. Things are getting better. But to hear it from the people who have experienced it themselves.
Yeah.
I think that New Horizon on decision making, obviously we've not developed that, although I think some of what we're doing around data will naturally evolve. I think the focus at the moment is around, local authorities, social work, those types of organisations, and it would be good to widen it out. And so to look at education, to look at health, and look at a much broader sense of within the community, that understanding of young people's experiences, but also the value of those relationships and how they can be supported just in an everyday way and
the way that's sort of been badged is, decision making from the earliest stages of solution focused meetings in schools or whatever it might be, all the way through. And I suppose there's a big link there again to the whole family well-being, whole family support sort of aspect, where it might well be a long way away from the more formal processes of reviews or children's hearings or court, whatever it might be, but those earlier stages, which are often going to be most crucial in terms of folks coming together around families, hearing what families are saying in terms of what's important to them, the relationships that matter to them, how they can be better supported, where it is going to be a really broad group of people. Again, a big theme today was, who are the folks who know us best, and often it's going to be someone different from the person that you might expect. So that's a lovely possible theme for the early part of next year. If we're still standing after New Horizons on kinship and housing. And Francis, any sort of hopes, sort of feelings about where the next coming months might lead for the community practice or more broadly?
Well, obviously I've not really been as involved. I think Elaine's point about just relationships, because I suppose I've been referencing lots of that, maybe not thinking just about just sibling-like relationships, but it is about who matters to children, isn't it? Their whole world. And absolutely that would, community and others are part of that. So I think you're right. I think that sounds like a really interesting kind of progression. So I would agree and concur.
Okay.
So
and you're happy to give us from the New Horizons collaboration a little update in due course, from November onwards, about how the tests have changed on the data story. That leads, I suppose, just finally to some practicalities for anybody who is interested in getting alongside the community of practice for siblings, which is an open door for anybody in Scotland with lived experience, with professional expertise, whatever it might be, from whatever sort of sector or organisation you come from, or whether you're just coming in a personal capacity. How, if you're interested in getting involved, do you learn a bit about it? And also, how do you access some more sort of insight into some of the learning or some of the inputs or whatever's been covered at previous community of practice sessions?
Yeah, so Stand Up for Siblings, the website, is the host for the community of practice resources. So obviously Stand Up for Siblings website is a whole host of information anyway, and is a great place to look for young people, for carers, for adults working in a variety of sectors, really, and for kinship carers and sibling kinship carers, where you've got an older sibling caring for younger. So we've got all sorts. The community of practice has its own section, which is lovely, and it has a link through to resources. So we try and endeavour as much to have everything from, like, the reflections from today will be typed up and summarised and popped on, so that people who couldn't make it can see the outcomes from today. The different breakout groups can hear what everyone else was saying. Things like access to the Glasgow's Family Connections Assessment Plan is there. People are so wonderful about sharing their resources, and that's the place to look. You can sign up. If you go onto that page, you can sign up, and that way you never miss any communication, because it will come through your email box, and there'll be all the notifications about the in-person and the online events, as well as other activities that are happening around the country.
Yeah. And that includes the newsletter, which is a really lovely sort of summary, goes out, on a regular basis to all those who've signed up. Really rich resource that also has links in it to some of the material that you're touching on. So it's all there, and you can also book for any of the events, both in person and online, via that page. I think you were saying, Kate. Lovely. So that's an open door offer for anybody who's keen on getting involved. Thank you so much, folks, because it's been a long day. We've had a full day of the community of practice for siblings at the beautiful reporters' offices, where they're just about to launch in November a whole brand new set of hearing suites that have been really designed alongside those with lived experience that Neil Hunter, the principal reporter, was describing as really he felt a game changer in terms of trying to be responsive and thinking about the paradigms we use for the spaces for making crucial decisions in people's lives. But we've been there all day with a beautiful bunch of companions, and then we've come across the wild streets to do this. So I'm really, really grateful for the energy to share your thoughts and perspectives on the community of practice and New Horizons. And here's to next steps in the year to come.
Yeah, here's to 2026.
Oh, that sounds scary.